Hi there, this is Dave from Motels on the Chrysler and Plymouth Dance.
And it's kind of a funny story. You all know the Chrysler story, right? Basically, you have Maxwell Motors. The Chrysler car was already being developed by a separate group run by 3 engineers. We have Maxwell Motors, and Maxwell has been making cars since 1904. 1912, they go bankrupt. Walter Flanders buys them, puts his Flanders car into production, calls it the Maxwell. The old Maxwell is dead, and then they continue on. Like most leaders of what becomes Chrysler, Flanders has a few really good years and then just sort of drifts off while in place, and the company comes close to going under. And then Walter Chrysler comes in to save it in 1920 or 21, depending on which source you use. He brings in his engineers to fix up the old Maxwell, and he brings out this B70 that's been developed by people outside of the company. He starts out with the Chrysler car, which was developed by Zader, Skelton, and Breer, and almost came out as the Zader motor car. And that was called the B70, Model B, because it was the second car intended to be a Chrysler, designed by Zader, Skelton, and Breer. First one was designed for Willis, at Willis. The 70 because it could go 70 miles an hour, and those of you who have cars from this era know that 70 miles an hour is hot stuff in 1924. And the answer I've gotten is the Packard Super 8 is the only other car that's in some semblance of mass production that could do that kind of speed. So it's got 68 horsepower, which is a heck of a lot from a 6-cylinder in those days. That is, of course, brake horsepower, so it's actually less than that in today's terms. But it was still like, wow, that's a lot of power. 4-wheel hydraulic brakes. First, well, technically the second car ever made with practical 4-wheel hydraulic brakes. But there were like 5 other companies that tried hydraulic brakes, but none of those systems really work. If you went out into the desert, your brakes would lock up. If it froze outside, if you drove into Minnesota, your brakes would fail. If you drove around for about 6 months, your brakes would fail. So this is the first practical 4-wheel hydraulic brakes. He sells it for $15.95, which is not a high price. Meanwhile, the Maxwell keeps on going. It's got 2-wheel mechanical brakes, 38 horsepower. 1926, Chrysler slaps his name onto the Maxwell. No idea why he did this, because at the time, wide-range car companies were not the norm. If you wanted to make a 4-cylinder and you were making a 6-cylinder, you'd make a new brand for it, right? You wouldn't just slap it under your own brand. Here we have the Chrysler, big selling point. We've got hydraulic brakes, yay. So what do? We throw in the Maxwell. It's got mechanical brakes. It's an old design. It's got splash lubrication in the engine, whereas the Chrysler has an oil pump. It's still a 4-cylinder, so it's kind of an odd idea. And it's called the Chrysler 58. 1928, we go from everything under one name to this big explosion of brands in one single year. DeSoto comes out, along with Fargo Trucks, to pressure Dodge Brothers into lowering their price because he's trying to buy Dodge Brothers. So he finally buys Dodge Brothers in the middle of the year. Now you've got Chrysler, you've got DeSoto, you've got Dodge Brothers, you've got Fargo Trucks. Just to make life even more complicated, he spins off Maxwell, it becomes a Plymouth. Just changes the name and it's magically a Plymouth. And now it's got standard hydraulic brakes. So there's some irony for you. Hey, we've got hydraulic brakes, let's change the name to Plymouth. Now, marketing pretended that the Plymouth was all new, and they circulated a story that Walter Chrysler went to Henry Ford with the Plymouth and said, here's my new cheap car. And Henry Ford looked at him and said, Walter, you'll go broke. I got that market all locked up. I highly doubt that this happened because, of course, Chrysler already had the Model 58, and they had had the Maxwell before that, which competed with Ford. Ford still had much more volume. So 1929 to 1946. DeSoto and Dodge are between Plymouth and Chrysler, so there's some serious distance between the Plymouth and the Chrysler, even when the Plymouth is completely redesigned in this time, and it's made into a much superior car than it was. It's got a better 4-cylinder engine. The whole thing is just dramatically improved, but DeSoto and Dodge are there sort of in between, so Chrysler is still pretty high up, and they still have Imperial as their top model. And so the marks are defined by size, trim, engines, and completely different bodies in some case, and the engines were really, in a couple of cases, really different. So they kept these two brands apart. Post-war, Walter Chrysler, basically, he stayed at Chrysler much longer than anybody would have reasonably expected him to. He's a transformational leader. They usually stay on for 3 or 4 years, get bored. Walter Chrysler leaves for the New York Central Railroad in the 30s and dies in 1940, I believe.
Yes.
So he's gone. After he leaves, People don't respect Plymouth very much. Walter Chrysler understood that the heart of the market was with the Plymouth, so he did a lot to keep investment high in it. K.T. Keller, when he could be brought to care about the car business at all, did not see things that way. He just saw margins. Think of Stellantis today. Cheap cars, no margins. Why would you invest in those? And Chrysler kept this attitude towards Plymouth for quite a long time. In the 70s, you might recall that with the 68 Charger 500, they figured out aerodynamics. The window has to bulge out a little bit in the rear. The rear window has to bulge out a bit. The window that Valiant had, they realized that was taking off about 20 miles an hour off the top end speed. It was killing gas mileage. It was making it noisy. I asked, why didn't you invest taking the Duster rear window, which was based on an aerodynamic study, and applying it to the Valiant sedan? He said, we tried. The executives said, we barely make any money on those cars. If we're lucky, we break even. Why on earth would we spend money retooling? So the window design that was put in 1968 continued until 1976 in the USA and until 1982 in other countries. And the whole time it was that awful concave window that robbed performance. So they cut investment in Plymouth, they cut the options, and the mark dropped from being a premium above Ford and Chevy to being below Ford and Chevy. 50s, 60s, 70s, the brands all start getting wider. Every automaker, every mark starts becoming more diverse. They stop having a different mark for each type of car. So Dodge dives down into the Plymouth land, and every Plymouth has a Dodge version. Valiant is created in 1960, and it goes up and takes Plymouth sales, basically. And Plymouth itself gets into the large cars as Chrysler stays all large cars. Chrysler has one basic body design through all of this. Imperial's been split off by now. So they solved this crisis where Plymouth sales ended up at the end of 1960, they saw Plymouth sales were basically, so they merged Valiant into Plymouth, and now Plymouth is basically Plymouth plus Valiant, but most of the sales are Valiant, Barracuda, and later Duster. So most of the sales are basically Valiant cars, and then there's some Plymouths on top of that. Dodge, oddly enough, gets a version of Valiant as well, although it really shouldn't. If they had any brand discipline at all, it wouldn't have, but they didn't. And I have talked to people who have told stories. Yes, we really tried, we tried to instill brand discipline, but the dealers just yelled and screamed and had tantrums, and we ended up giving them whatever they wanted. They wanted a Chrysler that was cheaper than Dodge. We gave them a Chrysler that was cheaper than a Dodge. Unibody comes in 1960. The cars start sharing body structures, so now Chrysler and Plymouth both have the same body structure on the large cars. Every Chrysler is a large car. The top-end Plymouth is a large car, same body structure, so they differentiate it in overall length. They differentiate sometimes in wheelbase, but that's a little expensive when you're dealing with a unibody car. Features, trim, sound insulation, engines. Chrysler always had the biggest engines as standard. You could buy a Plymouth with a more powerful and bigger engine than a Chrysler, but it would be an option. Fuel economy days come in, and this kind of wallops Chrysler because suddenly nobody wants, quote, a boat anchor engine, and nobody wants a, quote, land yacht. So the big cars do not sell. And this is not the government coming in and saying you can't make big cars, because people say that now, but if you look at the sales figures, and if you were alive during that day, you remember what the kids were saying. Somebody would drive by in this beautiful New Yorker and they'd laugh at him and say, oh, what a piece of crap you're driving, land yacht. That attitude was in the 80s too. It just kept on going. In their desperation, they restyle a Volare, they put in extra welds, they put in extra sound insulation, and they have what they call the M-body. Although as far as I can tell from talking to a lot of people, the M-body and the F-body Volare were exactly the same car in just about every important way. There was no reason to have a separate M-body platform. The windshield even had the same tilt. So on the left you see a Volare, on the right you see a Chrysler LeBaron. Now note the price difference. Volare with the V8, the same V8. This is the 318 V8, $39,005. The LeBaron, $50,066 with the same engine. Has a nicer dashboard, has nicer trim, more sound insulation, has extra welds though, so it's not really the same car when you're driving it. It's like if you get, unless you got the Volare with the towing package, in which case you also got extra welds, and it probably was about the same. It keeps on going though, because that's, as you know, These cars weren't the most fuel efficient in the world. They were just more fuel efficient than a 440 would be. You're still looking at, gee, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get 18 miles per gallon on this highway trip if I stick to 55 miles an hour. So now we have the K cars, the front wheel drive. And the K cars really were pretty amazing, especially coming from Chrysler in the shape that Chrysler was in when it created them. That was one of those things that Chrysler occasionally does. When the chips are down, suddenly the corporate rules are suspended a little bit so that we can survive. So we get the K cars. The Chrysler and the Plymouth have the same engine, body, suspension. The Chrysler gets more sound insulation and nicer trim, and it has more standard features. So look at those prices. The Reliant $59.90, the LeBaron $81.42. That's a premium. The thing that gets me is, okay, look at the E-body also. The E-body is an extended Reliant, basically. E is for extended. They take the wheelbase, they stretch it out. I think it was 3 inches, I might be wrong. Plymouth Caravelle, $9,007. New Yorker, $12,865. There's a premium, same engine. Did customers buy it? This is what shocked me when I was writing this book. The formula always worked. And this is the thing that's really fascinating to me. People would buy the Chrysler. If you look at the same years, and you look at the Dodge Diplomat, Plymouth Grand Fury, and Chrysler Fifth Avenue, that was basically the Volaris that we just looked at. These are all on the same, more upscale body. They made the Plymouth Grand Fury just for the police. They made the Dodge Diplomat, but pretty much only police bought it, and they made the Chrysler Fifth Avenue. People bought those things in droves. They sold really well to civilian buyers. I think I've met one person in my life who bought one of those things in Dodge or Plymouth form. But I've met a bunch of people at the Chryslers. And if you look at the sales figures, the Chrysler way outsold the Dodge and the Plymouth. It's weird to me because the difference in those 3 cars was really minor. So it worked. The crazy thing is the strategy worked. You put a little extra chrome on, you make it look a little nicer, you put a little more trim, a few more options, and people bought them in large numbers. So basically, Plymouth was being starved a bit, and it was restricted to the low end. Lee Iacocca came in and he said, well, we need some sort of brand discipline because this is silly to have 3 versions of every car, and the main difference is styling with different sound insulation, and we play with the standard features. So he said, okay, we're going to shove Plymouth down to the bottom. And Plymouth won't get, for the most part, cars with the turbo 2.2 engine because it's a premium engine and Plymouth is a value line car. He said Dodge is going to be our sporty car. Before this, in the 70s and in the 60s, people remembered Dodge as having sporty cars, and it sure did. But who was in NASCAR more often winning races? It was Plymouth. Plymouth made most of the really sporty cars at Chrysler during the 60s and 70s. They made the Roadrunner, they made the Duster. Dodge had the Charger, admittedly, but that was a higher-end car and it sold in lower numbers. When the Plymouth Breeze came out in the 90s, it was a year after the mid-size cars came out for Chrysler and Dodge. The Cirrus and the Stratus. The Breeze was not meant to happen. People started harassing them. Where the hell is my Breeze? Chrysler dealers would call up and say, look, I need something cheap to sell to people. Cirrus comes only as a high-end car with a V6. So the Breeze gets a 4-cylinder only. The Dodge, of course, gets a 4-cylinder or a V6, your choice, because Dodge gets whatever it wants. Chrysler gets some unique cars. They get you remember the LeBaron Coupe, the LeBaron convertible, beautiful cars, the Imperial, and they got the biggest OH cars, and eventually they got the 300M, although that was really a rebadged Eagle Vision, so I don't know if it counts. Dodge always had a firmer ride. Chrysler and Plymouth had a softer ride during this era of the 80s and 90s. And that continued until the 2008 minivans. Basically, the reason why Dodge tended to get whatever it wanted was because there were 2 types of dealers then. Chrysler and Plymouth started out with separate dealers in 1928. Plymouth had its own unique dealers. Depression hits. Chrysler dealers suddenly are having a hard time selling cars. Walter Chrysler says, well, let's merge the 2. Chrysler dealers can sell Plymouths, Plymouth dealers can sell Chryslers. So Chrysler and Plymouth had the same dealers, but Dodge was always separate, so Dodge, according to the dealers, had to get one of each. So Tom Gale cooked up a plan to save Plymouth because the writing was definitely on the wall for Plymouth. And the Gale plan was based on the Plymouth Prowler, was the test car for it. And then the first real Plymouth was to be this beautiful neon-based car, the Plymouth Truck, or PT Cruiser as they called it. And after that, he had a Plymouth Voyager designed, which would adopt that same basic styling, and then he was going to do a version of the midsize car, the Stratus. And he was going to make Plymouth basically all crossovers, all 30s styling, all the time. And the idea was Plymouth will be unique, it will have its own visual identity, it will have its own interior identity, it will have its own feel, and it will be all this one unique body style that right now, the sedans are still what you buy, right? It's still, 2001, sedans are still king, or pickup trucks. It was a very clever plan, and it probably would have been a resounding success, partly because the PT was at first, and partly because crossovers were the future. Not many people saw that, but that's a crossover design. So, 2000, the decision to kill Plymouth is made at the top, and they tell Tom Gale, and he quits. 2001, there's the last Plymouth is made, it's a neon, and the Chrysler dealers start threatening to sue because they don't have the cheap cars to sell anymore without Plymouth. God forbid they should only sell Chryslers. So they assign all the Plymouths to Chrysler, including, heaven help us, the Plymouth Voyager, the base model minivan, goes as the Chrysler Voyager for a couple of years and then becomes a town and country touring. Chrysler has a full lineup for the first time since 1928, hurrah! And we quickly realize why they only had a full lineup in 26 and 27 and stopped doing it in 28, because it's a bad idea for a car maker that's making its premiums off of charging like 20% extra per car over an economy car, having this massive premium that people are happy to fork over. Well, they're not so happy to fork it over when you're selling economy cars too. And that's why Walter Chrysler really created Plymouth, is because it was not sustainable to have Maxwells and Chryslers with the same badge on them. It was hurting Chrysler. So sales fall. It looks like sales aren't falling as badly because the PT Cruiser comes in and it's selling in six figures and it's a big success. But sales are falling, and most Plymouth dealers, according to the research, just left the company entirely. Didn't buy a Dodge, didn't buy a Chrysler, they just left. So here's an example of how bad this policy was, because I've been talking in generalities and anybody can say stuff. So here's some numbers. PT Cruiser in 2001, they started at $18,415 for that car. I'm sure the Plymouth would have started cheaper. That's $32,657 adjusted for inflation. I ran it through the CPC price calculator, which is more than a Jeep Compass. 2007, admittedly, this is after Daimler had come through about 8 times and cheapened it and taken stuff out and made it look worse, $16,000. It went down in base price over time. $24,000 today. Now that's the same price as a Toyota Corolla, a base model Toyota Corolla. So we're talking about something that started out roughly the price of, say, a starting Jeep Cherokee or Dodge Charger, ending up selling at about the price of a base Corolla. You look at the minivans, the Plymouth ran from 19,000 to 25, the Chrysler from 28 to 37 in 2000 before Plymouth was killed off. 2007, the Chrysler starts at 22 and ends at 36. If you adjust for inflation, I'm pretty sure it didn't change at all in price. I will be honest with you, and I think Chrysler does a lot of weird stuff.
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure it's what we would have called a data-driven organization when I was a real consultant. Wrapping it up, Chrysler was always matched by high-end Dodge. Tom Gale did make Plymouth unique. Dodge would be the mass market. Plymouth would be retro modern crossovers. Chrysler would be luxury. It was a very clever plan. I think it would work better than today's plan of Chrysler sells minivans, Dodge sells muscle cars to an ever-declining audience. My theory is that without Plymouth, Chrysler can't sell at a premium. You can't have a premium brand that sells cheap entry-level cars. The perception that people have will not work that way. Say where we are today. So there's no Plymouth, obviously. There's no replacement for Plymouth. Part of me thinks that they could put Jeep into that place. Jeep was a premium brand for years and years and years. Despite anything that Jeep actually did, they got that aura. But today, I think that aura is mostly gone. So in theory, because people really only buy crossovers and pickups anyway these days, Jeep could probably slot in below Chrysler, but they still keep thinking that Jeep should be above Chrysler at Stellantis, so that's probably not going to happen. At Chrysler itself, they make 3 different models according to Chrysler. Pacifica, Pacifica Hybrid, and Voyager. So they make one vehicle, it's a minivan. publicly stated product plan is to have 2 large cars or crossovers in 2026. Because they switched to an interesting engineering plan which involves having international teams point fingers at each other and say it's their fault, all of their plans are now behind schedule. So, do I have any questions?
Why did it take so long for Plymouth to get the Hemi when they were winning on the track?
And the street Hemi was not developed until after NASCAR said you can't race an engine that you don't actually sell to real people, which was a sensible NASCAR decision that I really can't argue with. And it took about a year to develop and start producing the race Hemi. So it was that decision plus about a year. Dodge, I think, got it at the same time as Plymouth. I don't think that the 426 Hemi was restricted in any way. Plymouth had all the divisions had the same engines. Chrysler, of course, would only take the big engines, the 440 and the 426 at that point, or the 413. Dodge and Plymouth could have any engine they wanted. All right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice job.